Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ramalingaswamy Center's colloquium series on equity and social determinants of health. We are thrilled to welcome today Aparna Uppaluri to be our speaker. You know, when we started having these conversations with Aparna about what she could do, there's so many possible topics that she could speak about. And in fact, just a few weeks ago, she was part of a panel discussion that our center organized on men and mental health at NIMHANS. But there's so many other things that we felt like she had to share with us. And, for those of us who work in the nonprofit and research worlds, our ability to get funding has become increasingly challenged and driven by certain imperatives. And there's no one better to speak on this topic than Aparna. So today she'll be speaking on philanthropy and worlds of evidence, sifting through power, experience, and expertise in public health. A little bit about Aparna to start us off. Aparna Uppaluri is a global executive and senior philanthropy advisor. Recently, she founded Antara Advisory, which is a specialized strategic philanthropy impact advisory. She's a chief advisor to the Grow for Climate Funds and serves on the global advisory body of Equal Measures 2030 and the Sustainable Futures Collaborative and several boards of global foundations. Until recently, she was the chief operating officer, leading philanthropic programs at the Tata Trusts, with operational and strategic planning oversight over all thematic areas, including livelihoods, health, nutrition, WASH, as well as arts and culture. In her previous role, she served as a senior global program officer for gender justice at the Ford Foundation and was the acting program director of the foundation's India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka office. Her global work has included nurturing philanthropic collaboratives, intergovernment partnerships, and strategic field building. She led a science and society program at the National Center for Biological Sciences here in Bangalore, India, and founded a performing arts collective, which she ran for 10 years. She is a skilled Odissi dancer. She's an epidemiologist and a public health professional by training, but I think you can tell from her bio that she is so much more than that. Welcome, Aparna. We are so thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you, Amma.
Just a couple of small announcements. There will be a discussion afterwards that will be moderated by a consultant at our center, Gayatri Menon, who has known Aparna for a long time. So please, as questions come up during the talk, you may feel free to put them down or come up with them afterwards, but we hope you'll engage in a discussion at that point. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we ask you to put your questions in that. On that note, thank you so much, and the floor is yours, Aparna.
Thank you, Abba, and thank you for all of you who've participated, an afternoon in the middle of the week to take time away. I really appreciate your interest in this conversation. I must say that it is a bit discombobulating speaking to an empty screen. So if any of you feel comfortable keeping your videos on for a bit while I just set the stage for this this afternoon's exploration, I would really appreciate that because it'd be great to put some names and faces together. But this is a webinar. I can't see other participants. Is that right, Saraswati? Okay. All right. Thank you. So first of all, really wanted to thank Srilata and Abba for your interest in inviting me. And I've sort of taken this opportunity to be a little, I think, reflective about my journey, both in the public health space and in the philanthropy space. I think you will find me a bit biased in this conversation, and I'll state that up front, towards public health as a discipline, its eclectic nature, its ability to straddle across disciplines, and its very specific location, that I have experienced as a practitioner, sitting between sort of the social and the natural sciences in many ways. And in my own sort of life and practice, I have really drawn upon both the theoretical constructs as well as, the practitioners' struggles in public health in the work that I have seen and dealt with in the philanthropy space. So in a sense, I just want to, make a confession that this conversation is a bit autobiographical. And I thought, sort of keeping my feminist politics and principles at the center, I thought I should allow myself to put the personal, the political, and the professional all into the same box in this conversation. I'm also going to ask for a little bit of indulgence from the participants today, because what you might see today is a bit of a meandering walk through many different things. So not just public health, but a little conversation around the history of ideas. Abha had told me that some of the most interesting conversations you've had in this webinar series has been when you've invited philosophers. I'm also allowing myself to be a little bit of an amateur philosopher here because of my interest in the history and philosophy of science. But what I'm hoping that we can arrive at the end of whatever it is that I share with you is a space for a conversation more around how is the knowledge that we're producing, whether it's in the public health space or whether it's the knowledge that we're sort of giving greater legitimacy to in the philanthropy space, how do we sort of wrestle with those structures, and what will it take for us to wrestle with those structures? Because fundamentally, in my own practice, both in public health and philanthropy, what has been front and center has been the issue of social justice. And public health for me is very much a discipline that centers social justice, as much as there are very large technical aspects to its landscape. What I'm going to hope to do today is take fragments of ideas from different disciplines and string them together, at least show to you how I've strung them together in my head, so that you can critique it. We can find ways to develop maybe different sets of arguments around how sort of words like evidence and impact and experiment gain so much power, whereas the fields that we play in, whether it's in public health or philanthropy, often don't allow us to question that power. And in a sense, this is a bit of a, I would use the word reverie, right? It's this conversation is a bit of a reverie. So I will also ask you all to sort of sit back and take your practitioners' hats off, take your theoreticians' hats off, and try to listen to it a little bit like a story, because I think maybe we can connect with the deeper issues if we think of this idea as a story, right? What is this thread of evidence building that seems to sort of tie so many things together for us today, in a world today where data has become, yesterday I was at an event where the data has become like air, right? We're breathing air, and we're also sort of breathing in and breathing out data all the time. And so one is often stuck with what we do with all of this data, and this frustration that data is not becoming actionable evidence. And the discomfort that I sit with when I hear something that says data has to be actionable evidence is there is so much that goes into deciding what is actionable evidence and who decides, right? And what and how do structures of power get created. So you might see me going back very much in history, like 400 years ago. I'm not going to project too much into the future, but I'm hoping that the last 45 minutes, we will do that with all of you together. So if you will just bear with me while I figure out how to share my screen, which we just tried to do right now. And I'm almost there. Okay, I hope that it's visible to all of you.
Yes, we can all.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Great, thank you. So I'm, representing now a newly formed organization, the Antara Advisory. As you all know, until very recently, I was with the Tata Trust and the Ford Foundation. Before then, in a role as a grant maker, as someone who was in charge of strategy for parts of these organizations. But what I wanted to talk about today was to really focus on, on this word evidence, and how it sort of strings together, straddles both the worlds of public health and philanthropy. And I talk about power, experience, and expertise. And what you will see is you'll see many reflections of how power gets built through my presentation, and the focus on expertise. I remain a little silent about experience because I'm hoping that it gets, in its silence, it becomes more present, but I will also hope that we can surface this more in our discussion period. So really, today's conversation will meander, like I said, around questions of evidence, the history of ideas, um, and power and participation, as in who holds the power and who participates in the building of evidence, and how does the history of ideas, like, flow through power and participation to sit around this very heavy and powerful word of evidence, which we often think of as a sort of value neutral condition based on which we make decisions. So let me begin with a little bit about, Abba had said that I'd also spent time at NCBS, the National Center for Biological Sciences, helping to build up their science and society program. And one of the things that we've done there is really to think about, how seriously do scientists have to reflect on the history and philosophy of science. And it was during that time, and I had asked you for your indulgence about the randomness of this talk a little bit. It was during that time that I had actually read this book called Leviathan and the Air Pump by Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaefer, who are historians of science. And given my training in public health and formally spending about 14 years in clinical epidemiological research while I was in Canada, I was located at the McMaster University, which in a sense was the birthplace for this movement of evidence-based medicine, right? David Sackett and Gordon Guyatt were at McMaster. One of them moved to Oxford after that, another moved to Harvard. Brian Haynes, who was somebody that, I almost worked with, who set up the evidence-based medicine journal. They were all sort of in the milieu in which, in a sense, I had my intellectual grooming. And I had a certain sense of discomfort with the sort of linear conversations around evidence that were happening in the evidence-based movement. And so this actually took me to really start thinking about how does experiment become the all-powerful way of knowing the world, right? And I would just recommend anyone who's curious about this, and some of you might have already read this, to actually really take a look at this book, because it looks at the historical moment during sort of the English Restoration time on what does really knowledge constituted by, right? And Thomas Hobbes says that, and forgive me for oversimplifying this, but says that it's really how shared meaning in society becomes truth. Whereas Boyle's argument that it is through experimentation and knowing how things work that we arrive at truth. So in a sense, they both had the same end goal in mind, but at the same time had absolutely opposing ways of looking at it. And I think one would agree that they were probably each other's greatest critics. And what evolves, I think both of their thinking does survive even to this day, even in the state that governs us, and even in the way that we are dictated by the very powerful legitimizing power of science. So increasingly, as experiment becomes sort of the focus, in science-based truth, which is more dominated by inductive and empirical rather than deductive and consensus-based forms of knowledge production, one can already see that power starts to shift to experts, right? And so one of Hobbes's criticisms of Boyle's approach was that knowledge really gets produced by what he calls an exclusive guild, right? So and at that time in that political milieu, Boyle says that these gentlemen to whom he presents his experiments, to whom he displays, or quote unquote, according to Hobbes, performs his experiments, they lend legitimacy. So just wanted to take us back to this idea on how the conversations around the legitimacy of this word evidence actually could evolve. And this is just one narrative. There could be many, but I just wanted to share the one that had really intrigued me. And we all talk so much, whether it's in public health or in the philanthropy world, about this need for having evidence so that we can replicate, right? And replicability has become so central to the way that we think about, why we want evidence. But I found it rather curious that, the way that problems with replication were defined in the 1660s continue to be relevant to us today, right? That replication is dependent on contingent acts of judgment. And those of us who practice out in the field, I think we can relate to that almost immediately and instantly. A second is that if replication is the technology which turns belief into knowledge, then knowledge production is not dependent on an abstract exchange, but on practical social regulation. We know this from the way that social schemes work, the way that the state resources are distributed, etc. So fundamentally, replication appears to depend not on the sort of value neutral, effective functioning of men and machines, but really to a solution of social order. So, fundamentally about governance. You can imagine that as someone who was, trained only in science until my mid-20s, and hadn't really thought about these questions, this did come as a bit of a revelation, although I'm sure that that's not true of my colleagues in social science here today. But I feel that this is also, those of us who go through a very traditional public health training don't often think about this in this way. So let's fast forward to, let's say, somewhere between, the very fruitful decades between the 1940s and the 1990s, when this hierarchy of scientific evidence really gains prominence, right? Particularly in the field of medical research, and eventually creeps into, or permeates into the practice of clinical medicine as well. And the hierarchy of scientific evidence, while consensus is, I think, in a sense, subtly sort of implied, it clearly is experiment that becomes the dominant worldview. This is the hierarchy where RCTs sit at the, almost at the very top, with, meta-analyses and systematic reviews as processes that in a sense, by their very location in the hierarchy, also command the greatest power. But as you move up this hierarchy, participation, whether it is from the patient, whether it is from subjects of the study, continues to decrease. So there is, in a sense, in this hierarchy, another gradient of power that is invisible in the lived experience of quote unquote, subjects, agents, or citizens. And this hierarchy, in clinical medicine, in scientific medical experimentation, begins to replicate itself in all kinds of spaces. So this is another hierarchy that I found on a design website, right? This is really looking at sort of user experiences. So it talks about how do you work towards getting the best user experience, and where is the evidence for that? Interestingly, here they put expert opinion at the very bottom, right? But clearly, if you try to look at the parallel with these hierarchies, expert opinion still sits somewhere up here. While it permeates everywhere, the higher up you are in this hierarchy, the greater your expertise, right? So the fathers, and there was one mother, I think the birth of evidence-based medicine is attributed to about 5 individuals, if I'm not mistaken, depending on who's telling the history. And there is one woman, to their, I guess, to their credit. So let's look at this history of the idea of evidence-based medicine. And I just took these 2 clips to just sort of demonstrate how a story gets told to lend it legitimacy, right? If you look on the right, these are all slides that are sort of part of medical education syllabuses across the globe. And you see the Journal of the American Medical Association says it's 1992 when EBM is introduced as a new approach. And it's actually in the 90s because of the technology that becomes available, search engines and the statistical methodologies for systematic reviews, etc. And in the way they say it's push services, so knowledge distillation and push services, where certain ideas can really start. You can actually you can cull out those ideas from a large database that gives evidence-based medicine really its key tools, right? Its teeth come from that evolution in technology. But another telling of the story actually goes back to ancient Greeks and ancient Chinese medicine, and we see this constantly replicated. Anytime that we want legitimacies, we hark back to the past and say it was golden, and we're building on that golden past. And so there's constantly ways in which expertise and power work together to find different ways of telling the story. And once the idea takes hold is when it evolves into a system, right? And you will see that this ask, acquire, appraise, apply, and assess ladder of how do you practice evidence is something that starts then taking hold outside of medicine in so many other areas. We've seen development economics, for example, sort of embrace this very wholeheartedly, and the entire development sector gets quite, I would say, embroiled in this similar search for efficiency and efficacy. So let me just pick a case from public health to just sort of hone in on this idea, right? Antimicrobial resistance. I know that this is an issue that the Ramalinga Swamy Center has been working on. It's also an issue that's close to my heart because this was the first project I worked on, fresh out of my master's in public health, working for the Ministry of Health in Ontario in Canada, was to actually produce the first Chief Medical Officer of Health's report on antimicrobial resistance. And I must say that when we produced that report, there was very little historical analysis on what led to the production of antimicrobial resistance, other than really looking at the microbiological reasons and the rates of replication of bacteria, etc. But if you look at this image, the top is when the antibiotic was introduced, and the bottom is when resistance appears, right? So resistance appears almost within a decade or less of the use of the antibiotic. And it's extremely telling. And if there's a period when new antibiotics were not introduced, but there was still evolution that was happening, in new forms of resistance were emerging. And so this is what the CDC says, that simply using antibiotics creates resistance, and that scales of production is also the scale of resistance. And I throw this here almost just as to me, it was like a thought bomb, right? So here we are talking about scale. I know it's in a different context, but if human action is causing bacteria to scale the rates at which they can produce resistance, how do we go back and look at sort of root cause solutions to this very significant, very, very large public health problem? And I wanted to sort of talk about the practitioner's end, right, in the antimicrobial resistance conversation, debate, problematic, which is those of us who are familiar with the treatment of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis know that in clinical and public health practice, DOTS, or directly observed treatment, has been, in a sense, been accepted as the gold standard for treating TB and particularly MDR TB. But there was no randomized control trial that ever supported the efficacy or efficiency of directly observed treatment. And had we relied only on RCTs, DOTS might have been abandoned a few decades ago. But it was a combination of approaches, a mixed methods approach that looked at everything from gene sequencing to economic analysis to looking at sort of community clusters, and other fallouts of multi-drug resistance TB, and really looking at the social determinants of what drove high rates of MDR TB that led to the recommendation of DOTS to be supported. And so, this is just a case in point about how, a very significant and important public health problem would not have been addressed the way that it's being addressed, even though we still have a very long way to go, had we just stuck to this particular hierarchy of scientific evidence and not used mixed methods. I didn't want this to be a conversation that sort of runs down RCTs, because I do believe that they have their place. But when I call out an RCT here at the top, I'm really talking about the salience and the power that we attribute to experimental modes of production of knowledge, increasingly within the context of needing solutions at scale, quote unquote, right? And so much of public and population health really is around finding solutions at scale, which is in practice and philosophy something that philanthropies are constantly struggling to do. They're struggling for attribution and scale, right? And at the heart of much of philanthropy's quest for the legitimacy of how its funds and resources gets used, rests at, with attribution and scale, which, in our field of public health, we will talk about causality and replicability at scale. And I'm not going to say anything new here, but we know now there's enough science that tells us that RCTs are answering this question reasonably well within a very controlled context, right? This is the larger question around how does an intervention work? When I say it, we're talking about, an intervention or a treatment or an action that one takes. What the RCT doesn't seem to answer is why, right? And the whole issue of scaling really needs the why to be answered, because increasingly there's another word that we're hearing a lot about, which is systems change. You need the system to change for our actions to have larger at scale impact, then we need to have answers to why. So the limitations of the RCT methodology in giving us good, strong micro answers, but not being able to answer the rather sort of macro questions. And I think how it works is a macro question, is something that, a question that both philanthropies and public health sort of grapple with. And my sort of submission to my colleagues in the public health space is that, both in terms of our epistemic engagements, I mean, the relationship between sort of our epistemic and then the ontological implications, what emerges from that, I really believe that there is a lot that we can do in public health to build frameworks, to pose questions in a way that can actually maybe shift some of these power structures. So, let's just sort of take a close look at RCTs, again, as a stand-in rather for the larger conversation around experimental truth as the more legitimate truth, right? And we all know that philanthropies, I mean, I will confess to you that recently, about 2 months ago, I was in a room with several philanthropists, and there was a conversation about, effective ways of making education and healthcare services accessible to, excuse me, sort of remote communities in the Northeast. And there was an individual who had formerly worked with the armed forces, who was from that particular region, who had, great deal of trust across the spectrum, both with the state and communities, who was running this intervention, an extremely impressive intervention. And one of the philanthropists said, "This looks great. I'm happy to fund an RCT." And it was extremely well meaning and well intentioned. It was to really say that we believe in this so much, we would like to lend greater legitimacy so that more resources can flow to this work. Now, the immediate fear that those of us who understand RCTs would think that, if a funder says, "I'll fund an RCT," the donee would immediately say, "Sure." In rare cases, do donees question that funder power, right? But in this particular case, an RCT would never be able to demonstrate whether this intervention was effective because of the founder and the team's ability to build trust in that community, to be able to negotiate effectively with stakeholders, to really have deep contextual knowledge, or whether it is just the way that they had, designed, let's say, their curriculum, because all the RCT would be able to do is test the effectiveness of, the curriculum that they had developed. And so, it's the exact same problem that we've been talking about on the public health side also as well. But what I have been sitting with as a practitioner who's transitioned from public health into philanthropy is that while philanthropy has sort of adopted the hierarchy of evidence, in the place, where it originated, there is greater debate around its applicability than there is on the philanthropy end. And I think that needs to shift, and that needs to shift rather quickly. And all that to really say that, you know, this is now sort of fairly standard knowledge in the methodological space, right? Which is that what RCTs really do is give us a comparison of the means, right? And when you do a comparison of the means, the precision of your average treatment effect reduces. It also means that there is a focus on the center of the distribution and not at the margins. And those of us who are working on social justice issues or working on issues of inclusion and equity, which is the core of, let's say, what public health do, and one hopes what philanthropy wants to do, is that RCTs are not able to give us that answer, because the difference in means doesn't really give us an answer on what's happening at the margins of those distributions. And because of the assumption of homogeneity in the effect across these distributions, there is a flattening out of the factors that we need to be focusing on. So in a sense, just to quickly bring us back to what Chapin and Schaefer were saying about the way that knowledge gets produced, it's clear that knowledge gets produced in artifacts, right? And by artifacts, I mean, here's what one study says. Here is an expert opinion. Here is, an ethnographic study. And so knowledge in that sense, Chapin and Schaefer say, is artifactual because of the conventions through which we produce it. And this is the line that stumped me and that I liked, which is that we realize that it's ourselves and not the reality that is responsible for what we know. The word I'd like to draw your attention to is how we see ourselves, right? Do we see ourselves as the experts who have power, the resources, communities that have the lived experience? So how do we sort of really unpack the structures of how knowledge is getting produced across these two areas of work? So just sort of really bringing it back to the nuts and bolts uh, of what we're talking about when it comes to change at scale and population level indicators is the idea that the distribution is sometimes more important than the average, right? And maybe a couple of quick examples to sort of bring us back to that point, which is, really looking at inequality in disease burdens when we're looking at treatments is usually, the whole thing around reaching the hard to reach. Um, Increasingly, we are even hearing arguments that it's important to address inequality because it's bad for the economy. It's as terrible as saying is we need to get more women to work because our GDP needs to grow. But as pernicious as that worldview might be, um, it is also true that unless we figure out what to do with um, those that are really at the bottom of the pyramid of sort of the inequitable distribution of wealth and resources and disease burdens, which clearly intersect. Um, so we need measures that actually give us that strength, and the hierarchy of evidence clearly doesn't. Um, and so there are examples across both these distributional aspects, but even something like large cancer trials, for example. Um, the way that we look at the stats and the way that we're taught to read the stats um, is, for example, if you were to take the statistical measure of the number needed to treat, um, looking at a particular drug's efficacy, one also really needs to be balancing it out with understanding of the number treated to harm. And increasingly, the number needed to treat as a statistical measure is sort of, I would say, declining in salience in clinical practice, and therefore its larger underpinning, I think, would have consequences in public health, and philanthropy will have a little bit of catching up to do in that understanding. But why is it that RCTs or experimental approaches so favored by philanthropies and foundations? And there while there are many reasons, I think we've just sort of summarized these three. Right, one is that evidence-based philanthropy is seen as value neutral, and we've talked a lot about how it's not possible for it to be value neutral. So the idea that it is scientific and divorced from ideologies and morals lends to philanthropy a greater legitimacy, but also risk mitigation tool. And a lot of it, you see, will actually become about risk mitigation in the narrative. Metrics, when it comes to working with marginalized populations in particular, again, becomes a risk mitigation strategy. And the whole question of bias, which is that if evidence is value neutral, then it has to be also politically unbiased. And I will leave it to my very erudite audience to really take their own position on whether it is possible for this kind of evidence to be truly politically unbiased. And by politics here, I'm really referring to how power is structured and negotiated. So, in a sense, philanthropy, I think, I'm not going to hesitate in calling out that philanthropy does exercise ideological power, right? And it has the power to control discourse on what a social problem is. But if those of us, who are, now in positions of building discourse with philanthropy, finding ways to shift discourse in philanthropy, these are the things that we really need to be talking about is what does a blind adoption of the hierarchy of evidence do to the actors, the nonprofits who are working with communities? What are their core roles as community anchors and resource developers? how, as capacity builders, what is the role of community-based knowledge in this work? And my contention, my instinct, my belief and faith is that a public health as a domain has a great deal of both expertise and experience, if not power, to build on these things, in a sense, to both present a counterfactual to the way that philanthropy has built its own legitimizing hierarchy of evidence, to also offer new sets of tools, right? I mean, it isn't just enough to criticize, but also to be able to offer new sets of tools. So, there's just a few recommendations that we have pulled out around this. But what I wanted to end with is, I presented earlier Angus Deaton and Cartwright's critique on what, both the understanding and misunderstanding of RCTs that was published in Social Science and Medicine. But I want to end with Lant Pritchett's work, and his paper says, the title gives it away. It says, "Rely only on rigorous evidence is bad advice," right? And why does he say that? He's saying that, I mean, it summarizes everything that I've been saying through in the last 40 plus minutes, which is that relying only on rigorous evidence, which means that highly controlled um, situations, right? Experimental design needs a lot of control, and so I leave it's anyone's guess how possible it is to exercise that control in a social setting. For example, testing the efficacy of an intervention across like randomized villages on preventing child marriage, right? Those kinds of things, I think, really to think about bias, contamination. So really, is it logically coherent? Does the hierarchy of evidence apply? Statistically, there's been a very high variability in impact estimates. We've already spoken about external validity issues. But I think the key thing also is around broader evidence. And I think it sort of behooves all of us to really think about what will it take. We're in a very different time than the English Restoration, fortunately. But what will it take for us to really shift the discourse around broader evidence and build its power? And of course, there's always the said and unsaid reality of bias, which shows up even in very rigorous studies. And since this is not a conversation on that methodologically, but I know that all of you are well aware of this. So I'd like to end with this quote from Pritchett, because he's one of the more vocal critics that we have in the development economic space, and has done some work in the healthcare space and in the philanthropy space, which is why I've chosen him to end with. And while it is true that philanthropy is still very much exercised as a personal choice by individual and living donors, and as a professional choice by more professionally run foundations, what he does say is that just as we diversify financial portfolios, philanthropic portfolios also need to be diversified, but that a larger share should be devoted to non-linear and potentially transformative agendas. And the reality is that increasingly foundations want to put 100% of their funds into proven and cost-effective linear interventions. So I hope that my friends in public health can help move this conversation forward with philanthropy in this methodologically rich, fertile, and I would say controversial space. So just really want to thank Abha from the Ramalinga Swami Center for following up with me continuously for this talk, and my colleagues Pai Swini Taylor and Amna Ahmed for supporting me in putting this together for all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aparna. That was a really fabulous kind of laying out of the kind of epistemological boundaries we seem to have to either operate within or have to navigate and circumvent somehow. I would encourage people to put your questions in the Q&A box, or if you've written them in the chat, then please do so there as well. I think what is, extraordinarily powerful is this idea of how evidence comes to be fetishized in a way that seems to it seems to kind of compel us towards thinking about evidence as that's all that we are lacking in order to fix a social problem. And so it's carrying a lot of weight in order to be able to in these kinds of applied fields that we have, that public health practitioners typically operate in. And it's also extraordinarily curious, given the kind of contemporary political context that we live in, why evidence comes to be fetishized in such a way when, the evidence everywhere, so to speak, is that it is challenging to see how facts are actually compelling actions. And so it's a really kind of curious, contradictory kind of world within which these kinds of decisions around what kind of knowledge to produce, what kind of knowledge production to invest in, kind of operates. And I think here philanthrocapitalism as a term has been around for so long. And I think in its initial days, it was understood in a fairly simplistic kind of way. But I think what your talk really helps us understand is what is the place of risk in thinking in both knowledge production and in philanthropy. And we are looking increasingly at these kinds of risk-averse knowledge production, risk-averse philanthropic investments. And that's something that actually excludes so many populations who and the kinds of ways in which they talk, and the kinds of ways and realities that they have to navigate. From a kind of a feminist epistemology kind of perspective, the heyday of knowing your body and being able to talk about your bodily evidence, that seems to have been completely kind of circumvented in this current dispensation. The moment of the 1960s and 70s of community participation, of community knowledge, local knowledge systems, it's challenging to see how that can carve out and hold a space in this kind of financial and epistemological kind of landscape. And so it would be really interesting to hear a little bit about some of the more inventive ways in which, let's say, community-based groups have tried to deal with this demand largely for numbers, or for this translation of experience into numbers.
Thank you, Gayatri, and thank you for so eloquently summarizing. I feel like you said so much more than I did, and that was really lovely. So thank you for that. So, I mean, I think I want to sort of keep the conversation rooted in sort of more the foundational principles of how this thinking is evolving and how can we build tools to address it. So one is, let me begin with what you said at the end, is how do communities cope, right? In a sense, I think right now we're really talking about how do you cope when numbers become all powerful, But where is the love for these numbers emerging from, right? And what happens when actually those numbers emerge? Are we able to act on them? And one of the things that I have really sat with as someone who's been in the philanthropy practitioner's role is, when you demand numbers, what do you do with them, right? And I think the communities that have most effectively been able to build space for conversation or argument with their donors is when they have been able to build power to ask that question, right? And I think the dominance and, in a sense, almost a fear to ask this question has increasingly led to a shrinking of that space. To say, sure, we'll give you the numbers, but what will you do with them, right? So in few times in my funder practice have seen this happen effectively. Is most of the time the power gets reinforced and re-legitimized because that question doesn't get asked, right? We all know as researchers that when you go to communities and you extract data from them and the community gets nothing back, that power differential already begins to shape the knowledge that is produced out of it, right? And so and I've seen it happen on rare but some occasions effectively, and I think that's a strategy that has to be adopted increasingly, because it is not a question of, I mean, challenging power is a good thing, right? Because it can then also shift your knowledge landscape. Because at the end of the day, let's say, if you attribute the most positive intent to all actors, whether it's the philanthropic donor community, whether it is the intermediary organizations, or the larger organizations that then sort of work with community-based collectives, there is a hierarchy of power, and there are modalities through which that hierarchy of power needs to function, and the power has to get exercised. And numbers have helped build that legitimacy without question. But just asking the simple question of what do you do with these numbers and how will it benefit my community immediately shifts the conversation. And it's not a wrong question to ask, right? It's a conversation. It opens the conversation towards, well, okay, numbers are important, but maybe not these numbers. So when you start to shape the conversation around which are the numbers that are lending legitimacy, maybe there are another set of numbers. The idea is not to say the numbers are bad, but if you're just collecting, I mean, there was a study that that I had sort of helped review recently, where there was a range of not-for-profits that were asked to collect data for donors, and on average, they were collecting about 130 units of data, and no more than 30 were being used. Right? They were actually that either had utilitarian or impact evaluation use for the one who was collecting the data. So just simply asking that question actually starts making that shift happen. The other thing has been around, at the philanthropy side, there is a strategic essentialism that has crept in very deeply. While there is critiques around, should we be promoting more trust-based philanthropy or, strategic philanthropy? I argue that even trust-based philanthropy is a strategic approach, right? And it's unless a donor organization is convinced so there is a strategic essentialism that is embedded in it. It's not simply a value-based shift. So I think we need to have more public discourse and conversation around these questions, because these conversations only happen amongst donors. There's no, and if philanthropy is seen as a capital resource, and here I want to qualify and say philanthropy often describes itself as patient capital. But what you see in the push for quick evidence is impatience, right? So we need to sort of, I think, in a sense, that holding up of the mirror has to emerge from social actors. academic centers, organizations like yourselves and others, to really begin that discourse. Because I will also say that, most philanthropists really want to do good. They want to do the right thing. But it's much easier to latch on to established, legitimized forms, not legitimate, but legitimized forms of knowledge production and seeking than it is to experiment, right? And here I'm going to use the word experiment in its very sort of double-edged meaning, and because it's about risk taking. It had scientists not taken risks, would we have the knowledge we have today? So I think risk taking is an important part of discovery, right? And exploration and charting new paths to quote unquote reach the unreached. And I think maybe we need new language to frame this, because one of the things that I find is that many brains shut off when you, let's say, just use a rights-based framework or, an equity framework. But, are there different epistemic traditions that we can borrow from? I think that's the kind of thinking that I feel might be missing for us right now. I don't know if I've answered your broad set of questions, Gayatri, but.
No, you certainly did. And I think, kind of laid out the kind of the political stakes in the different kinds of ways in which we approach this particular landscape. That was really helpful. We have a couple of questions here that kind of help elaborate this conversation. We have someone asking, will having a diverse philanthropy board composed of people at the margins help fund a different kind of public health? And I think this, a really important question, because the kinds of knowledge production that is seen as legitimate produces a certain version of public health. And certain kind of powerful ideas of public health that occlude other ways of thinking about and practicing public health. So just starting with a fairly basic way of trying to expand the boundaries of that conversation is this person's question. And I can and I think Amita Pitre's question kind of latches on quite nicely with this, which is to say that this may put the onus of asking questions to the most powerful in the philanthropy cycle. How can dialogue happen more proactively among the donors?
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. I think one can vouch for the fact that donor boards are not diverse enough, right? And the voices that donors listen to at their board level, at the highest levels of power, are often not representative, right? And the mechanisms for that pipeline to be built vary, from donor agency to donor agency based on their history, their sort of values, structural issues, etc. But I think Amita makes a very good point, is who do you put the onus on? And this is what I think I was trying to say earlier, Gayatri, is it is a dialectic, right? If the conversation happens only at the donor cycle, who actually incites that conversation? Who injects doubt, right? Because often they either become echo chamber conversations or self-congratulatory conversations. And this is not limited to the donor world. This happens in any circle of experts, quote unquote, right? Is either we push towards consensus. I mean, that was Hobbes's way, right? Which is a shared understanding of the world is truth. And today it's that an experimental understanding of the way is the truth, and that's the shared understanding that has been developed. So my submission would be, and there's no easy answer for this because there's a massive power differential. but that the conversations need to start happening at all levels. Like this conversation is a good example, right? A good example of why coming together around this question of methodology, the domain of public health, which is eclectic and interdisciplinary and can invite many forms of sort of epistemic investigation, and a conversation that happens at the philanthropy level that can borrow over a period of time. These changes happen over a period of time, right? So what are the ways in which we can develop new metaphors and new ways in which we can hold up mirrors? And it could mean a multiplicity of approaches. It could include pushing for greater board diversity, right? Even something like gender diversity at the board levels doesn't exist today in many philanthropic organizations at the donor level. Like you still have all male boards, for many major donors. So is there a regulatory push that we should be making? Is there so I think there are multiple ways to think about how can one actually inject these questions, and how do you build a more sort of build the dialectic rather than to think of more one-off ways of doing it, because I think that itself will fall apart, right? While it's important to have board diversity, will you be putting pressure on marginalized groups to always have to speak for themselves, right? And will that actually break the power differential? One could also argue that having someone from the margins on the board is helping to build their power as well. So I think it needs deep conversations. But my short answer to that would be we will need a multiplicity of approaches, and we have to think about this as building a dialectic and not interventions, right? So you need conversations at multiple levels and across. Having it only in rarefied spaces might not work, is my sense from having been on both sides.
We have a few more questions, and looking at this space between the kind of the valuation of the experiment versus the being experimental. Vijay Sarthi asks, can you please give an example of an effective alternative to a linear evidence-based intervention? And Praful Kapse asks, it is very important to be experimental. However, we see the scale is limited among philanthropic organizations philanthropic organization support for innovative or exploratory public health interventions. How can how will we be able to kind of shift the needle on this?
At some level, I think I've answered this question, but let me summarize. One of the examples I gave was the TB example, right? Which is, methodologically, RCTs are restricted, but they have their power. They have their place, within the toolkit of scientific experimentation, but they have their limitations, particularly when it comes to measuring social change, right? The effectiveness and evidence on social change. They could be potentially directional, but to attribute a larger level causation and causality to RCTs, I think methodologically we're beginning to see that there is that could be questioned. But I like the way that you framed the experiment versus the experimental, right? And I think the spirit in many philanthropies before, I would say, the strategic philanthropy bug caught on so intensely was really to be experimental, because in a sense there is recognition. See, it's only when philanthropy became very, very large, right? With the advent of philanthropies that had budgets, in some cases larger than some country budgets, or budgets that were contributing more than country budgets to sort of global organizations. Until then, philanthropy had an awareness that its capital had limitations on what it could change. And therefore, the focus on that being experimental to bring change about was greater. Today, that shift has gone from being experimental to experimenting, right? And quite often, that experimenting seems to come with a predetermined agenda. And there's evidence, on this. Like if you look at, there is very robust evidence in the medical literature that, when for-profit organizations fund research, there is very clearly a bias in the average treatment effect, and it's extremely well documented. So the and philanthropies on their own cannot scale, and I think this is the most important thing for us to remember. Philanthropy's aspiration is to build evidence that can be scaled, and very often the assumption is that if we can help build the evidence or fund to build the evidence, then the government will take it up. So this is again a linear approach that is growing. But I think one has to remember that philanthropies, very often don't have the either the resources or the political legitimacy to work at scale, right? While there are sort of social, political, economic arguments that can be made around designing for scale, the implementation of scale doesn't happen by a philanthropy, and philanthropies don't have that power, and nor should they, right? So yeah, I think that's my response. Yeah.
No, thanks. And I think there is an interesting conversation really to be had, perhaps at a later state, on how we understand scale, right? And how if it's possible to think about scale beyond a kind of a replication model of scale. But there are already some questions here that Rohit Shah has asked, which I think you've actually answered. As a rejoinder to Dr. Aparna's words, RCTs cannot address the complexity of a complex of a complex system. They are a simple answer to simple questions. What leads to what is their answer? But then philanthropy needs the why and the how, which is a risky venture to invest in for the direction of the evidence it produces. How can this be tackled when finance becomes a major determinant of the kind of evidence produced? Can philanthropy be made to settle for other forms of evidence for relevance? And I think much of what you've said, both in your talk and in your responses so far, actually addresses some of them. But if you have some further thoughts on it, please do share. Subhendu Bhattacharya asks, considering it'll take time to really understand and bring change in the dialogue surrounding evidence, what steps do you think can be taken within the existing system to allocate or receive grants beyond the received understandings of evidence? And he continues to ask, how does a child rights organization effectively leverage use of RCTs to demonstrate impact and build credibility, thereby enhancing its ability to raise funds from donors? What are the challenges and ethical considerations that a child rights organization might face when using RCTs for evaluating its work? How can addressing these help strengthen donor trust and fundraising efforts? And to what extent do donors value evidence from RCTs in funding decisions? And how can a child rights organization effectively communicate such findings to secure support? I mean, we're not even really opening the door to talking about who the knowledge produced by these experiments belongs to, right? And what are the ways in which you can address some of those kind of ethical, political, economic considerations related to that. But I think there are a whole bunch of questions here, most of which I think you responded to, but it would be interesting to see if there are other things that you would like to use as a jumping off point.
No, thank you all for the engagement and those questions. So I mean, one thing I do want to place is, I want to be careful about our choice of words around. I mean, I don't think what we're trying to drive for is getting funders to settle for different forms of evidence. I think we have to challenge the primacy that is given to one type of evidence over another. Now, and to your point, Gayatri, that you made earlier, is that evidence is fetishized, right? You made a very powerful statement. But then you also hear in many of these conversations in the rooms that I am, which is that storytelling is as important as collecting hard numbers and the data, and numbers don't give you the full story. You hear this all the time, right? But really, to ask a donor, how many times has storytelling influenced the strategic direction of your giving? That's a question that doesn't get asked, right? So I think the fundamental point that I'm trying to make is we need to ask new sets of questions, and we have to frame them in new ways. And if I were to really sort of pull out a thread from my presentation and the questions that have come through here, that thread really would be that we build on pre-existing knowledge, right? But we don't question the basis on which that pre-existing knowledge was built. So I think for us to be able to trace back those threads, so and I don't want to, specifically go down the route of talking about the child rights piece, because, it's a specific domain and it has, ethical considerations, donor specificities, etc. It'll be hard to answer that question in detail in this forum. But what I would offer would be to say, what's the kind of evidence that a rights-based view generates? What is the kind of evidence that a feminist view generates? What is the evidence that an experimental RCT-based methodology would generate? Can you demonstrate a comparative analysis? Not just a systematic review that pulls together 10 RCTs and does a meta-analysis, but says, here are 5 ways of looking at this problem. And if each of these 5 ways is giving us a completely different insight, what I would really advocate for and push for is how do we build, how do we help build power and legitimacy for greater interdisciplinary mixed methods approaches in our measurement frameworks, right? What is the space for hybridity? What is required to generate robustness in that hybridity, reliability in that hybridity? And that's where, that's the role of actors like us, who are, either practitioners in civil society organizations, public health practitioners. One of the reasons I've sort of taken a little slight step away from the donor world and decided to set up this intermediary organization is really to think about how do we create space for these conversations. How does one who straddle both worlds help create space, help create bridges for conversations. And I think somewhere when we stop looking for immediate solutions, I recognize there is urgency, but the quest for quick solutions is what leads to pushing an RCT, right? So if we were to, let me just take the example of what Shubhendu was posing, is exactly like if you were to say that if I were to assess this situation from 5 different methods, these are the 3 answers I'm getting. This is where there's convergence and this is where there's divergence. And this is how it impacts our work. So we need to find a different way of presenting evidence, talking about evidence, and asking questions about the foundations of what we're building on.
Thanks, Aparna. I think in a certain sense, you've also responded to Mayuresh's question about coming at it from indigenous communities' perspective, trying to understand, the relationship between those knowledge production practices and politics, related to philanthropy. You started off with the talk with this idea of, with this question of what does it take to make data into actionable evidence, and who are the stakeholders in that process and in that negotiation. And I was wondering, as part of a way of kind of bringing this talk to a close, um, if this idea of actionable evidence and the ways in which storytelling, uh, community-based knowledge production systems, indigenous knowledge production systems, and precisely the idea that you made is that can we actually look comparatively through these comparative epistemologies, in a certain sense, to think about how we produce actionable evidence that actually that takes hold, that makes sense in the locations that they are most needed. I wondered if you had any particular questions that you wanted to leave us thinking about in terms of that, in terms of trying to figure out that space, because I don't think there are any clear answers, but there are really some important questions kind of fermenting in that space. And it would be lovely if you could share some of those.
Thank you. So, I mean, what is clear, see, we keep hearing this, right? That knowledge has to be contextual. Um, we can't have decontextualized, deracinated storytelling. And that's what happens when you look at numbers alone. Numbers have to be interpreted, they need to be made sense of. But from where I've been sitting in my own journey in the last, I would say, 12 to 15 years, across sort of scientific research institutions and philanthropy and public health practice, community work, building an arts collective, like a range of things, right? Looking at modalities of collectivization. Very hard question to ask. How do you establish effectiveness of arts-based work? Right? This is a question I get asked all the time. Deeply experiential, embodied, needs presence. So I got asked this question very recently, and it just sort of struck me. I said, if you want to talk about community healing, in a community that's been affected by trauma of any kind, good way to ask a donor would be that, in addition to sort of mental health services, which can be really expensive, can you think of something other than an arts-based approach? Sort of really sort of reversing the power, like in a sense, there are ways to reverse power hierarchies. I bet you that, 7 times out of 10, or at least 6 times out of 10, 5 times out of 10, you're going to get an answer and say, no, you know what? I think arts-based approaches are pretty good, because that's not the work that they're doing. So, you're on the ground, you understand the power of an arts-based approach, sort of a singing circle, or, using theater work for healing in gender-based violence or whatever, as an experiential thing. And that's why, label my talk power, expertise, and experience. Is how do you build power when you have the experience? And that's something that we have not sifted through even in our methodological approaches, right? So when we talk about braiding different epistemologies together, is how can we build power for the lived experience, is something I think it's a quandary and it's a challenge, but it's very real. And today in the philanthropy social change world, the focus has shifted from a rights-based approach, the rights-based discourse, to more talking about the effectiveness of interventions, right? And while it might depoliticize the agenda, I don't think it completely blockades the possibilities of doing work. And I would really take it as a challenge to think about how one can work with this reframing? Can it give rise to new methodologies, new expressions, new forms of engagement with each other and across the table?
Thank you so much, Aparna. This has been such a wonderful, thought-provoking talk that you've left us thinking about all kinds of questions. And really, for those of us who are kind of working with or committed to working with populations that are marginalized, know all too well how kind of certain kinds of epistemologies have been, in fact, some of the driving forces of marginalization of the populations that we work with. And so this, to actually to be able to have this conversation about these kinds of epistemological politics at work, not as something that is a terribly esoteric conversation in some kind of philosophy class, but as something that is fundamental to how we work and think about primary healthcare, how we think about, marginalized migratory populations in a world where which only see sedentarized populations, right? So to start thinking about the kinds of epistemological politics at stake with the kind of work that we do has been really, really fascinating. So thank you very, very much. And thank you to all the audience members who asked questions, who listened, and I'm sure are still kind of mulling over some of the questions and observations that Aparna made. So thank you very much. The talk will at some point be posted, some point very soon, be posted on the Ramalinga Swami Center YouTube channel. So if you want to, share this with other people, if you want to listen to some of this again, that's where you'll find it. Abha, over to you.
Thank you, Gayatri. Thank you, Abba. Thank you all for your patience.
I think you said it all, Gayatri. Thanks so much for, thanks to Aparna for a very thought-provoking talk. As Gayatri said, I think these questions will sort of be spinning in our head for the next few days. And thanks, Gayatri, for moderating this so brilliantly. Many thanks to both of you and all of our attendees.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.